Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. This is Pascal, and I am joined today by Associate Professor and the Director of the History Department of the School of Religion at Queen's University, Dr. Adnan Husain. Husain, welcome.
It's great to be with you, Pascal.
And I'm sorry, I should have said Adnan. Of course, Husain is your last name, but either way, I'm very grateful that you're coming online. You've been researching actually the West Asia for the most part of your academic career, and you've actually developed quite a bit of a framework in order to understand what is currently going on with Israel, and that's what I would like to talk to you about. Can you maybe give us a little bit about your background, your research, and then tell us how this shapes your outlook at West Asia at the moment?
Yeah, thanks so much. And again, it's a pleasure to be on with you. I'm what I would describe as a medieval Mediterranean and Islamicate world historian that has specialized in the religious cultures of the Mediterranean and the interactions between Muslims, Christians, and Jews over the medieval period, basically. And so that covers everything from looking at the interrelationships between these religious traditions and their spiritual or mystical or theological dimensions, but also in historical terms, everything from the mixed societies where there was some semblance of coexistence, of tolerance, of living together in places like medieval Spain or Al-Andalus or parts of the Balkans, or frankly, you could say all across the Islamicate lands or lands where Muslims ruled, which were, of course, populated by longstanding groups of people who adhered to monotheistic religions in the Near East, in around the Mediterranean, whether Christians and Jews, and those societies under Muslim rule continued to be very diverse ones, where those populations existed for millennia up until today, although I would say that the modern Middle East in the post-colonial period has been particularly devastating for that tradition of heterogeneity, diversity, and cosmopolitanism. So I'm also, however, interested in some of the unhappy cases in the pre-modern period also that helped pattern what I think of as some of the abiding and recurring structures that transmit themselves after they're formed during the medieval period into forms of war, holy war, crusades. Um, and in fact, actually, what I'm at work in doing right now is trying to detail and articulate an understanding of the transformation that takes place in Europe um, in the 11th to the 13th centuries, where it becomes what I would call the crusading society. So I would characterize the work as a project to study the formation of the crusading society and what that is, and how it has reverberating consequences for subsequent Western history, and particularly in its relation to the Islamic world.
I find this so important because, some of these concepts of history is something that especially Europe and North America today look at as closed chapters, right? So most Europeans would say colonialism, no, closed chapters, learned our lessons, not doing that anymore. Feudalism, closed chapter, and certainly Crusades, closed chapter. We know it's part of history. We know it was violent, but we're not doing that anymore. Um, I'm pretty certain you have kind of a different perspective upon that one. But before we go there, can you explain a little bit the concept of crusading society? Because like the Crusades in the
Yeah.
plural is usually what we talk about to describe these different periods when different groups of Europeans, one after another and in concert, then went down to the Holy Land and, on the way, pillaged and plundered and murdered and conquered and then went back. Can you maybe explain a bit why you look at this as a society?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because very often when people have studied the Crusades in the past, the long tradition of scholarship on it, it was something that was fascinating to historians, medieval historians, but it appealed to a particular kind of historian who was interested maybe in military history or thought that the romance of this kind of folly of like idealistic, ideas about going to Jerusalem, were somehow kind of oblique to or extraneous to the fundamental paradigm of European history and its development. It's just something, kind of that happened, but the trajectory of European history was based on a whole lot of other developments, internal, political, social, cultural, intellectual, and so on in its transformation, right? So very often the Crusades is not really integrated into the story of how Europe becomes Europe in the way that it does. And my thesis is that you can't really understand the effect or importance of the Crusades only by studying them as a military phenomenon that had a beginning and had an end, but rather we have to look at it as a process by which Europe, I would say more accurately at this time, before really Europe is the category that we would think of this society, is really Christendom, and particularly Latin Christendom. And in fact, actually, the very idea of Christendom, particularly Latin Christendom, as something like the lands that recognized the suzerainty and of the Pope, who guaranteed the legitimacy of political order in the kingdoms and so on of these various polities, that was sort of Latin Christendom. It's almost coterminous as a concept with crusading and with the start of the Crusades.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video.
And so my point here would be is that we need to understand that these were wars and mobilization for wars. They're organizing, they're preaching, they're financing, they're administering, they're provisioning that happened from 1095 to 1291 in a very transformative way. If you think a society that organized 9 massive military mobilizations over the course of almost 200 years, 1095 to 1291, and ceaselessly in the periods before was talking about, the need to recover the Holy Land, regarded the loss of, say, the county of Edessa, one of the principalities, of 4 principalities that were established, the so-called Crusader states of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, as a consequence of the first very successful crusade, that the loss of Edessa in the 1240s became its own emergency around which there was a mobilization that had to take place for the Second Crusade, and the loss of Jerusalem to Salah-ad-Din in 1189 then called forth the Third Crusade, and the desire to kind of expand the territories led to the Fourth Crusade, which went off the rails. But sacked Constantinople, and then now led to a Latin, Byzantine Empire controlled by these former Crusaders. And that itself imposed all kinds of new sort of obligations that led then to, the Fifth Crusade, the Louis the Ninth, the Seventh Crusade in the 1250s, that essentially it's very hard to talk about European history or Latin Christendom's history during this period without thinking about the consequences of this constant mobilization for war, a sense of emergency that put pressure on how you should organize Christian society in order to have proper order, to make sure that you didn't have the descent of heretics. That had to be suppressed. We need to purify. One of the explanations for why the subsequent Crusades went so badly and why there were constant losses to Muslim resistance against the Crusader states was, of course, to turn inwards and say, we must have been sinful. We can't tolerate these dissenters. We, have to purge the sin. And so we need to purify society. And so there was an ordering paradigm that is yoked to the Crusades and the consequence of the Crusades that leads to persecution of heretics, persecution of Jews, persecution of the Muslims who are conquered in places like Spain or in Sicily, or there's even a small Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, in the early 13th century, put down a major revolt in the eastern part of Sicily that had been, populated by Arabs. It was a very diverse society. There were, Arab, Muslim peasants, but there were Greeks, Jews, and then, of course, there were Latin Christians under the Normans in particular. And there was a rebellion, and he put down this rebellion in the eastern part of southeastern part of Sicily, and decided the best way to make sure that there wouldn't be future, rebellions from this population. He removed them and put them on the Italian peninsula and created a city just for them. And they ended up turning, this very important place called Lucera that nobody has really heard of. I visited the ruins of his city there. There's one small plaque that talks about, what happened here. But there was, like, for 60, 70 years, there was a predominantly Muslim city on the Italian peninsula that was loyal to Frederick II and his heirs, the Hohenstaufens, and were part of his wars against the popes, during the 13th century, before they were ultimately liquidated when the Angevin monarchs of, Sicily and southern Italy, a kind of allied branch of Louis IX's family. In fact, actually, first his brother, Charles of Anjou, takes over, declares himself king of Jerusalem, and decides that as a good Christian king, he should eradicate this foul Muslim presence in the heart of, like, Christendom. So, what I'm saying is that there's a certain ordering of this Latin Christendom
Mhm.
internally that is a response in some ways to this unceasing external overseas wars that are very expensive, that are largely unsuccessful and constantly beset by resistance, and that experience of 2 centuries has a very formative kind of role in shaping Western identity and the shape of politics and society and culture for the future.
Yeah, this is a very, very good and I think important observation about what this does to not just this or that country, but actually to the way that the society itself was organized before that. And I think it's very pertinent to point out that the modern nation-state system, the way we know it, goes back more or less 1648, and the Crusades were way before that, right? Way before. And the way that the European continent and that the people on that continent were formed, and the laws that they abided to, and the belief systems they held, were not that much put into these geographical locations, rather than these religious the religious aspect was way more of an ordering system. And in this sense, the religion is not necessarily something that was under the nation. It was something that was different from the nation, but it was an ordering system, right? Not based upon geography, but based upon who subscribes to what kind of rule book. And the monotheistic beliefs are, of course, they all come with their own little rule books. So in a sense, a counter concept to the nation state. These crusades, they also kind of happen in the context or parallelly to the maybe one of the most important events, and that we don't talk about anymore, the Great Schism of the Christian Church, right? How does the schism and this differentiation between Eastern and Western Christianity play into what you're researching?
Well, that's a very important point. Is that you have two polities for the Eastern Roman Empire and some kind of confederation that we would call Latin Christendom, a kind of commonwealth of states that are always fighting with one another, but recognize some kind of common sense of political legitimacy under the Catholic Church and the governance of the Church. Um, and they shared many things in theological terms, the Nicene Creed, for example. And so there was a lot of compatibilities that defined both Orthodox and Latin Christian traditions against some of the other dissident non-Nicene forms of Christianity that existed in the Near East or even as far as Central Asia. But in the middle of the 11th century, because of disputes over many things. There was the filioque. I don't want to get too, deep into abstract theology, but how you understand in the creedal formula and the son, filioque in Latin, and differing interpretations about that from a theological and creedal perspective led to controversies. Other things like, things that exist today, which is the calculation. When should Easter be? When should some of these major religious festivals, even, when is Christmas, to be marked, and so on in the calendar, that gradually you have these disputes and there's a divergence where there's a schism. They don't recognize one another as being correct. And so I think one thing that happens, however, is that there are papal interests because the popes end up developing this doctrine of their universal supremacy and authority. They're constantly eager to bring the Greek Orthodox Church in, and the patriarchs back in to the fold, as it were, of recognizing the primacy of the apostolic tradition attributed to Peter that Rome symbolized, is that it's the church of St. Peter and therefore it should be the most prestigious. Now, of course, Greek patriarchs and, from old, centers of Christianity. Let's remember, Christianity really started in the Eastern Mediterranean. It didn't start in Rome. So there were places like Antioch and Jerusalem and places that were centers. They didn't necessarily recognize the Pope as anything other than a key major bishop from among the early centers, but nothing to distinguish him. However, the Eastern Roman emperors, who had political reasons to need aid and support against, say, the Seljuk Turks, who, after the Battle of Manzikert, towards the end of the 11th century, start to take territories in Anatolia, in the heartland of the Eastern Roman Empire that had already, of course, lost many of the possessions in the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Levant to Egypt to the early Arab Muslim conquests of the 7th century. They saw this as an alarming possibility that these Turks would come, and so they called for aid to the West. And were often the emperors were often willing to make some kind of accommodation on religious negotiations, and willing to bring the church, the Orthodox Church, into harmony with the Latin church, if the popes would help organize some support for the Eastern Romans against their various enemies. And so, in fact, the first call for the Crusade, in a way, comes from the Eastern Roman so-called Byzantine emperor. And he was probably thinking, a few hundred kind of mercenaries. Maybe we won't have to pay them if the Pope can pay for them, but a few hundred warriors to come help us would be wonderful. Instead, what he got was, after the call in 1095 by, Pope Urban the Second at Clermont, was an enthusiastic army of not just nobles, but people who embraced. So there was some famous figures like Peter the Hermit, who preached the first crusade and had rather apocalyptic and millenarian kind of radical spiritual ideas about what this kind of pilgrimage to the east, to Jerusalem, might mean. And so, there was always this tension between the two, but for political reasons, the Eastern Romans were more interested, the Eastern Roman emperors were more interested in some kind of rapprochement with the Latin Church because they saw it as a source of political and military support. But what you find is, over the centuries, as the traditions grew apart, that the actual clerics, the patriarchs, they were very, very resistant to any kind of sacrifice on principle. And so as a result, in modern history, these differences have continued to this day of being independent churches, even if they have had longstanding affiliations in the past of creedal conformity. But now they're, rather separate. And, I think over history, you've seen that there have been many alliances between Protestants, Orthodox Christians, Jews, and Muslims against basically the aggressive sort of Catholic power of the medieval period and the early modern. So you see strange bedfellows where Protestants and Eastern Orthodox are all, kind of in this position of being on the outside of, the Catholic Church.
Right. And I think this is quite important. And the Crusades were fought basically from the European heartland down to the Holy Land. And what is it then that gave this drive and that made it so popular? Why was it that 1,000 years after the death of Jesus Christ, suddenly there was this idea, let's go, let's march east and take it back, and the idea that Jerusalem must be held as a Christian city, must be under the Crusader dominance. What is it that makes that land so incredibly important? Because today, of course, I mean, the idea today is that the Middle East, and I try to avoid that expression. I prefer West Asia, but that the Middle East, the Europeans look down on that place, right? They look down on it in so many ways. That's where all the immigrants are from. That's where all the wars are. This is where the terrorism comes from, and so on and so forth. But can you take us back to the Crusades and how these people looked at the Middle East?
Well, during this time, of course, the Middle East is much more urbanized. It is part of these trading networks that connect the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean and to other parts of Asia overland. And it's this intermediate position and its long kind of history. Um, of kind of large scale political units of empires, kingdoms, and empires that made it a very prosperous urban source of human culture. We know many things like writing was developed, the first code of laws, all of these monotheistic religions, come from here. Even one could argue, I mean, this is something that, it's outside of my sphere in ancient history, but even if you look at the Phoenicians and the ancient residents of the Levant, of what is today, Palestine, Syria, the state of Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and so forth, is that the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, even their pantheon, and the myths around their pantheon were absorbed and taken up and adapted, but affected, Greek and later Roman pantheons and mythologies. Of course, every society and culture added something new and unique, but you can see that the Near East was an incubator for thousands of years of innovations, you might say, in human culture. And the reason why is because it was a kind of crossroads between many different places and peoples that would come together through these trading networks. It was comparatively urbanized. And so it was a source of great wealth. And the images that the Crusaders have of Palestine is of it as a land of milk and honey.
Right.
It's just dripping in wealth that properly belongs as a holy land. And in fact, this concept of the Holy Land is fairly, you know, close in time to the idea of the Crusades itself. It's not like some long, running kind of aspiration. I mean, for hundreds of years, and as Anselm of Canterbury, Archbishop of Canterbury, would say, among the few kind of critical voices about the Crusades, was that, well, Jerusalem is this heavenly ideal. It's not this earthly place. I mean, that's the whole point of the Christian narrative, is that we move from this idea of the Messiah as a king in a particular place, restoring the Jewish kingdoms, to the heavenly kingdom, the Redeemer and the Messiah, Jesus. And so we're all about, aspiring to the heavenly Jerusalem. He said, what is this like kind of like desire to go to this earthly place and conquer it? But he was really in the minority, because already for a couple of hundred years, and you could say, starting maybe in the ninth and 10th centuries, pilgrimage to Jerusalem started becoming very popular for people in the Latin West, penitential pilgrimage. So it wasn't just you want to go to visit a holy place, but the idea that if you had committed some sin and you needed to do penitential acts and works, pilgrimage, and especially a long distance pilgrimage to a prestigious sacred place, was one way of guaranteeing forgiveness for your sins and expiation of wrongs. And so it ended up becoming an extremely prestigious thing to do, became increasingly popular with the 11th century, in the 10th and 11th centuries. The routes, through Eastern Europe opened up because of the conversion of Stephen of Hungary. He became a Catholic monarch, and so you could facilitate this. It started to become more and more popular, and so aspirations and connection to Jerusalem as Christ's land, and going and visiting the places that he actually lived, increased in spiritual significance and importance in the imagination of the Latin West. And of course, they also had these geographical ideas of Jerusalem as the very center of the world. Um, and so, um, in addition, when there were, this is actually kind of a strange thing to me. It's a little bit like what we're seeing today about the absolute anger about Iran deciding to impose some kind of a duty or charge or a toll on transit through its territorial waters in the Strait of Hormuz. Is that one of the biggest complaints that you keep hearing in pilgrimage stories? Is that they're being harassed by the Muslims. They're being forced to pay tolls to go through the territory, and this is considered an absolute outrage against the dignity of uh, uh you know so I would just say there's this kind of funny way in which it seems that um that justifies military action for them. And so in some ways there was this idea that we have to avenge Christ because he is being subordinated, his sovereignty is being subordinated by this polluting, kind of filthy pagan rule, because they didn't understand Muslims as another, confessional religion with a monotheistic, creed and doctrine. They had these ideas that they were pagans, and were somehow defiling this holy place of Jesus that needed to be restored to Christian rulership. And one of the other things that the kind of complaints that appear very strongly in, for example, the accounts of the first of the speech by Urban II announcing the First Crusade, are concerns about these Eastern Christians. Okay, so the Greek Orthodox and Eastern Christians, that they are being cruelly and brutally oppressed because they're not living under Christian sovereignty. And there were also very lurid sort of tales of, even that they were forcible. I love this one. And in one of the accounts, forcible circumcision of Christian youth, and with the blood of the circumcision defiling the holy altars of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right? So there are these kind of like blood piety, which is very important for kind of Catholic Christianity. This is the body, this is the blood, but this kind of counter ritual and this counter kind of narrative that is this defiling and oppressive story. So in some sense, they felt that it was important to intervene on behalf of the Eastern Christians because they were brothers through the body and blood of Christ, that we take the communion together, and this unites us. And you see some kind of proto, I don't know if you could call it, there's definitely religious affiliation, but it's also this kind of body and blood, that we are part of one body and blood, that is this idea of Christianness that I think is partly on the path to a ethnicization of Christianity that starts to
Mhm.
take place, and that from there, it's not a huge step as we see maybe in Iberia in the end of the 15th and through the 16th century, a transformation of this religious identity and religious difference with forced conversion of Muslims and Jews, that it then creates a new boundary on kind of ethnicity and culture, and then ultimately racialization of the modes of difference, that is sort of at stake here. And so, one of the most famous Crusade historians, tried to argue that the reason why this happened was, and it's a famous article that he wrote called "Crusading as an Act of Love." Okay,
Mm.
so he wanted to kind of portray and understand this as part of a Christian ideal of caritas, charity, love your neighbor as yourself, and this idea of needing to intervene for the sake of protecting the Eastern Christians. And I would argue this is maybe the first version of the doctrine of the responsibility to protect. In international law, we have this new development of humanitarian interventionism. And you could say, in some ways, that. That the Crusades represented some early ideal in a religious language of kind of humanitarian interventionism.
R2P is usually traced back to Augustinus and the just war doctrine, but the
Yeah.
Crusades, I mean, it's what historical line into them. But
Right.
and, but let's jump even a bit further, because everything that you're talking about rings so many bells when it comes to, let's say, today's obsession of Europe and North America to tell us that it is up to us to protect the Judeo Christian
Mhm.
heritage. And you see the pilgrimage, especially of the top of the US political structure, pilgrimage to Jerusalem, putting on a kippah and then praying at the wall in Jerusalem, and do all of these weird acts, that performative acts of religiousness and piousness and connected. And of course these are mostly evangelical Christians, but that directly link themselves, and then also link their political power and their political systems into a system that is now dominating and has effective military control over exactly those holy sites. Can you maybe speak a little bit to how you see the the connection between in these 1,000 years of crusading spirit that has been governing Western Christianity and today?
Yeah, this is there's so much that one could say, so I will try and kind of focus on a couple of, I think, really important components of this. And also to say that maybe in some ways the best example of the perduring of the crusading spirit is Marco Rubio's recent speech at the Munich security conference, which most people interpreted as a call for recolonization, as it were, of the world, the reversal of the last 500, the decline or the ending of the 500 years of hegemony that Europe had, um, with colonialism and capitalism, and a reversal of the decolonization, that has taken place after World War II and so forth. But what I heard when he was speaking about it was on behalf of Western Christian civilization. And I think, there is embedded in his view a way in which this whole civilizational approach or perspective is sometimes secularized in language, as just like Western culture, European culture, but in fact, actually, the secularization of Christian culture and the structures, of thought and of politics and so on, even if they're secularized, there is a kind of continuity that now is being called forth to revive. And so that might be, in some ways, the more secular sounding version of the same sort of crusading spirit. But the groups that you're talking about and making their obeisance and their pilgrimages, dutifully, on behalf of this new concept called Judeo Christian civilization or Judeo Christian culture or tradition. This is a totally modern invention that has everything to do with some sort of post World War II, post Holocaust absorption of Jews into a Christian society that is effected essentially by Zionism and the settler colonial construction of a new, what I would think of as a crusader state. In my period, that I study, where this was formed initially, the Jew was, of course, an object of total, violence, of suppression and subordination, and interestingly, was very closely connected as a potential ally of the Muslim. And so I would argue that the roots of Islamophobia and antisemitism are actually intimately connected in the development of this crusader logic and the internal persecution, that unfolded from it, because every single major crusade was uh, uh, connected to and accompanied by intense, major violence against the Jews. In fact, you could say the first wide-scale, European-wide, Latin Christendom-wide massacres of the Jews en masse took place as a result of the First Crusade, the preaching of the Crusade. It happened again during the Second Crusade. Um, and even in the Third Crusade in England, there were, harsh restrictions put upon Jews and violence. And so what we have is a kind of pattern whereby crusading actually connected the enemies of Christ together. The Jews were enemies of Christ, and so were the Saracens, as the Muslims were called. And in fact, actually, they might even be in league with one another, which only advanced the fifth column kind of danger that transformed. And I would argue that the discovery of Islam as a religion, rather than just as a pagan, kind of, one among the pagan peoples, but actually discovering that it was a monotheistic religion with a scripture and, had, many things that would be parallel to the development of Judaism and Christianity as full religious, confessional religions, as we might think of them, that discovery actually really raised the stakes of the geopolitical and theological rivalry, where Islam and Muslims become a rival civilization. And likewise, it had deep consequences for the treatment of Jews inside of Europe, because the discovery of Islam, in some ways, and some of the ways in which they understood Islam as a kind of Christian heresy mixed up with Judaism, basically, is how some of the people who write about Islam, like Peter the Venerable, who was the first person to sponsor the translation of the Quran into Latin, as well as some other Arabic texts into Latin that could be used for polemical purposes. And he himself wrote a polemic against Islam, is among the first to really decide that Islam is, he asks the question, are the Muslims, are the Saracens heretici vel ethnici? Are they, heretics, or are they, just a kind of pagan people, an ethnos, right? Pagan people. And he says, I think they're heretics, and not only are they heretics, it's the summa totius haeresiorum. It's the sum total of all of the previous heresies in one horrific, monstrous, kind of force that he argues is, really oppressing the, Christians, the Latin Christians, because like most of Asia and even a part of Europe, they haven't even left a bit of Europe to us. They've taken part of the Iberian Peninsula, and so we're totally beset by the Muslims. And likewise, so that transforms into this view of the Jews now as, in fact, actually treated as heretics, and the abandonment of the Augustinian doctrine of witness that had said, yes, Jews are wrong, they can't see the truth, but they actually bear witness to the truth by keeping the holy texts of the Old Testament, as the Hebrew Bible was called, and it has all. They preserve all of the evidence that shows the truth of the coming of Christ. As a prefigured, all in the whole Old Testament. So don't molest them, slay them not. They should be subordinate in Christian society, but they have a place and a function in the world until the end of time, when, of course, they will be converted or killed, and that's one of the signs of like the return of Christ, is the appearance of Antichrist and the second coming of Christ. One of the things that will happen in the signs of these end times is that there will be mass conversion of the Jews. But until that time, they can keep their religion because it serves the project of demonstrating Christian truth. Well, by the 12th and 13th centuries, that kind of form of tolerance, if you want to, call it tolerance, I mean, but at least they could exist. That form of tolerance was itself kind of disappearing. And you have, under the pressure, I would argue, of this geopolitical series of wars and emergencies and so forth for mobilizing in the Crusades, that it ends up leading to massacres of the Jews. And
Mm.
so what's so strange is later in history that we have, as a result of modern, history and the establishment of the, Zionist movement, and the, state of Israel, we think today that, Muslims and Jews, they've just always had this kind of animosity. There's no way they could ever be reconciled. And, this has nothing to do with us Christians or Westerners. It's this, internecine, difference of these faiths, when in fact, this is a very recent phenomenon. Nobody in the 12th, 13th century, nobody until, the 1950s ever talked about Judeo Christian civilization, because the Jews were anathema to Christian civilization. They were a danger, that had to be dealt with. So I find it kind of strange and interesting the way in which this has been reversed. So we have to ask, how did that happen? What has happened? And my argument for what has happened is essentially that the crusading narrative was basically saying, we Christians, uh, in the Catholic kind of tradition, um, need to interpret, these kind of biblical narratives with us now as the subject and the center, right? We are the Israelites. And so we will go and establish, a kingdom, reconstitute, a holy kingdom. And you find this, where the Franks, in one of the speeches, versions of the speech, of the sermon of Urban II, um, celebrates the Franks as like the chosen people. You are a chosen people given this special dispensation by God to carry out this mission, to establish, the true holy kingdom of Jerusalem. And what happens with with Protestants is that they play with this narrative like with so many things, but they don't transform the entire structure and the narrative. They substitute different, they have a different critical view, and they decenter this idea of the church, now being the, inheritors and superseding, and develop a doctrine of restoration of the Jews is necessary, actually, as part of the events in the final, events of history. And so what happens is that Christian Zionism, as you well know, is precedes and is much more multifarious. But what's interesting is that for the Jewish populations, the creation of Zionism, you know, uh, and I believe, you're aware of this as well, is that, Herzl first is just looking for assimilation. That's what he
Yeah.
was always looking for. And it's like, oh, well, maybe if we convert, we can be assimilated. That doesn't
Yeah, he
work.
wanted to convert them to Catholicism, and said that's a solution. And then he went back to his flock, and they said like, "What? No, hell no!" And then, okay, need a new plan.
Exactly. And the new plan is, how do you become a European if you're one of these despised, oppressed, marginal populations? So you're a, dissident, apocalyptic, Protestant who doesn't belong. You're not wanted. Well, we send you, to the New World, and you can be a settler colony. You can create the New Jerusalem there. Or if you're an undesirable, you're a criminal, we also want to get rid of you. We'll send you to Georgia, and when the United States becomes its own independent country, the British will, send them to Australia. So these unwanted populations, they can be transformed. And that's what I think Zionism does, is it says you can become a European as long as you leave Europe and become a colonizer, a
Mhm.
settler colonizer elsewhere, then you will be redeemed. You
We
can
have
transform.
Yeah, we now have good news for you. You can be one of us if you leave us and continue the project, and then we will embrace you, and you will be part of the family of the good, right? Um, Plus, also, by the way, I mean, your religion. I mean, just don't take it too far, right? So that's why also, like, all of the actually believing Jewish, the real Jewish believers are either opposed to Zionism, or they use it in order to be there and do their studies, right, in Israel, but they do not support the Zionist project itself, which is a secular project, and play so well into evangelical Zionism, which also wants to use them in order to get to the end days in which they will all die or go to hell, and they themselves go up there. So it's a huge exercise of using. But one more thing, and feel free to react to this however you want. Um, we look at Israel today, a lot of us, as a colonial state. But if we extend what we just this discussion to the Crusades, one might argue that it is an extension of the Crusades, and not the settler colonial aspect is the most fundamental thing. The fundamental thing is the drive of the Europeans to the east, and ultimately, having failed to do so, then changing directions and going west. And as you said, New Jerusalem in the west. It's still the whole colonial enterprise. We could break it down and could make the argument is actually a crusading, an extension of the Crusades, not east but west, where they could go and in the end succeeded, because over there they could genocide everybody. They
That's
failed
right.
to do so in Jerusalem, didn't they?
Well, yes, because there was resistance. They were incapable. I mean, they tried, let's be honest. Like, in Ma'adra, they slaughtered the population, and they even, ended up having incidents of cannibalism that they reported themselves. When they conquered Jerusalem, it was an orgy of blood. It's even celebrated in some of the sources that what a wonderful thing, mirabile dictu, marvelous to say. It's like a miraculous kind of event. The blood from the temple, is flowing down. It's like a river of blood from the slaughter and the massacre. So, there was a genocidal kind of orientation. However, but it was impossible for them to succeed in doing it. And there was resistance, and there continued to be resistance. 1291 is the last of the, Acre Falls, and it's the last of the Crusader polities. And so they, in fact, do go west in precisely the way you're saying. I mean, let's think about this. The Mediterranean was the crucible in which they learned and practiced many of the techniques that would then become successful in the Atlantic world system and the creation of the modern kind of world. What were they doing? The Crusaders were trying to establish sugar plantations in Palestine. They also tried it in Cyprus. The Genoese were, very closely connected with supporting Crusades as part of their commerce, the transport, etc. They were the biggest slavers in the entire Mediterranean. I mean, some people think 40% of Genoese population in the 14th century were enslaved peoples from all over, from Asia to parts of Africa, etc. Um, so when it comes time for conquest, colonization, the plantation economy, is it any wonder that Isabella and Ferdinand turned to a Genoese who is the product of 300 years of experimenting and how we might, be able to establish these settler colonies successfully with enslaved labor, uh, and genociding, indigenous people. It's just that it ends up being successful. And I would say, if you study Columbus, it's well known. I mean, people have done very serious studies of his writings, diaries, what he read, who he was informed and influenced by. And he was influenced very closely by Yoakite spiritual Franciscans, which is this tradition from the late 12th and the 13th centuries of apocalyptic imagination. You might say it's an apocalyptic, it's an interpretation of scripture as a history of the future. Okay.
Mm.
Is like using a system of interpreting predictions or episodes in the biblical text as an analogy for what is to come, the seven stages of history, the seven antichrists that Joachim of Fiore talks about in his writings. And he identifies Salahuddin as like maybe the sixth. There's always seven, and everybody always understands that they are at the cusp of the final, right? Nobody thinks,
Yeah.
oh, yeah,
Yeah.
it's very far away, or at least unless you're Augustine, who was happy to say, yeah, maybe it's far away. But anybody who's interested in the apocalypse always thinks we're on the cusp of it right now. And so, likewise, these ideas keep getting updated. Like, oh, they look at history and they think these are the signs of the end. That will give us access and understanding to fulfilling the goal of restoring Jerusalem to Christian hegemony by going in this other direction. And we know Christopher Columbus had that as a very serious goal, and that he was informed by this kind of crusader Christian apocalyptic imagination. It wasn't just, I mean, that's the thing. We often think that the plunder and the material components, that you have to choose that it's one or the other. What I would argue is that the crusading nexus is not just ideas, but it's structures, it's institutions, it's practices
Mhm.
forged in history that become a paradigm for how you pursue, material gain and expansion of Christendom in the world through conquest and profit, and that these things very
It's
much
a
go
civilizational
hand in hand.
project. It's
Yeah.
civilizational. It's an all of society movement toward certain. I'm not sure if we should call it goals, but a certain endpoint.
Yes, yes. I mean, we have to say, like, I think, it's hard to say these things sometimes, but you have to say when you look at this history that genocide became a Western value. I mean, because look, we've all been struggling. How is it possible that like the entire Western elite has looked on with indifference the Gaza genocide? Like, how is that possible? How is it willing to abandon, in fact, even destroy the liberal order, international law? I would argue that it's because Israel is like those crusader states. It is,
Mhm.
and it's the last settler colonial project of Europe. And in fact, the Crusader states were, in some sense, the first Europe-wide settler colonial project, and they share that in some respects. And it's very different from the projects that were sponsored by nation states. This
Yeah.
is a project of the West as a
Yep.
whole, and
Yep.
I think that's why see the commitment is so broad across different polities among the Western elite.
Yeah, and that would explain it. Actually, that kind of framework would finally give a little bit of sense of these things that under the nation state framework make no sense. Just take what happened this week with the Israeli army navy going all the way to Greek waters, apprehending 170 sailors, bring them to Greece, and then the Greeks take over and make them walk the good old barefooted walk of shame to the airport. And two of these people were abducted to Israel and are now on trial in Israel. It's like the way that these systems interlink. They make much more sense if we think of them as a common project than and a long delay project, rather than just like narrowly this government and that government and the interest of this or that of that politician. No, it's these interlinking institutions, and within them, genocide. I rather than a value, will call it a method. It's a methodology.
Yes, that's
It's what it
better.
is.
Actually. Yeah.
I mean, and to Western Europe, it's the only civilization on Earth that managed to genocide three entire continents.
Mhm.
The I mean, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people that were killed by that very spirit that we just described in the last hour is insane, and is something that no other civilization has ever done to it's or never managed to do to any one of the others. So, and in a sense, we're now coming full circle, where then the Crusades that went east failed, when west succeeded, then are coming back to the original project, and they seem to be pretty close actually by now to maybe getting what they want. Although it seems currently again they are running into the same wall that they ran into 800 years ago, and that is the resistance of the East.
That's right, and I mean, I find it kind of interesting, of course, during the global war on terror, right after 9/11, announcing this new project, Bush gave this speech early on where he called it, this crusade, this new crusade, and then, of course, he had to take it back, and he apologized, he didn't mean it. It's not
And he
about
did mean it. He was
Of
very
course he
honest.
did mean it, but what's interesting is that was a time where, um it seemed like it was important to not to appear not to mean it.
Mhm.
Whereas now we're in an age where you can mean it, you can say it, it's okay. I mean, basically, it's what Netanyahu has been advertising is that we're your crusader state. We're on the front line in this war against Islam. And
Mhm.
so we're doing, and even didn't Chancellor Merz say they're doing our dirty work for us,
He did,
when
he
you're
did,
talking
he did.
about.
They're saying it out loud, and they say it in the same terms as they say, like, against the Orthodox heretics. The Ukraine is Ukraine is the forefront. Israel is the forefront against the Muslim heretics. It's like we're fully back. We're fully back in it. So, and
Reza
it's
Shah.
a 1,000 year, it's a millennium of obsession.
Yeah, and Reza Shah Pahlavi just, there was those pranksters, those German
Mhm.
pranksters, were interviewing him to try and pretend as if like they could help secure Germany's support militarily for the coming, war before the start of the war, and he said, "Oh, it would be really, helpful if they would join this crusade." I mean, so I think my point with this is that I don't want to make it seem as if this 1,000 years of history means that we are trapped in it. But it clearly, unless we really take into account what's at stake and what's at the root of it, there's no chance that we will be able to change and make a difference. We'll be caught in this pattern.
Yeah, but sociologically, it's absolutely beautiful, isn't it? When the true motivation that underlies the entire civilizational approach is so well hidden that the people who are under its spell even believe that they overcame this 300 years ago, right? It's not religion. No, no, we're secular. We're secular societies, enlightened, right? We are not religious. When in fact, everything that is happening that is of any kind of importance in world history is deeply rooted religious. I mean, you cannot even attack it because you first need to peel away so many layers until you get to the core that that it's very well protected in terms of an underlying motivation, isn't it?
Yes, and I mean, I think that's a very important observation because it also helps explain why, for me, in this moment, you can't understand politics of the West without understanding Islamophobia as a structuring paradigm. All of the anti-immigrant narratives and so forth, they make sense if you understand that there's this larger frame where historically the political culture is used to framing its own existential combat and rivalry is with the Saracen, the Muslim, and that it is somehow irreconcilable. It's impossible for there to be, and unfortunately, they only seem to pay attention to the crusading history and not maybe Al-Andalus and, medieval Spain and other places where, well, also, in fact, actually throughout the Islamicate world, these were diverse cosmopolitan places where it wasn't what we would be in the modern world happy with in many ways, obviously, but because nobody was a citizen, everybody was a subject and a subordinate of one kind or another, and there were depending on religious status, you had a higher social status theoretically, and so on. But there was respect for life, property, your religion. You maintained those things in a way that we find was not possible as Europe developed into becoming the crusading society.
The crusading society. I think it's a very very important and fundamental concept. I would like maybe we can do another talk, and I would like to add others, maybe Radhika Desai, people who um, like you have, a fundamental concept in order to look at what is happening. Radical Desai, of course, uses Marxism and the capitalist structure of the political economy as a way to explain all of the movements that are coming out of it. That kind of strikes me as separate from what we've been using in this talk, but it's very fundamental to understand the drivers, because otherwise we're not gonna be able to escape them again. And that, Adnan, is there anything that we didn't cover yet that you would like to point out? And if yes, please say so. If not, please let us know where people should go to find your writings and your publications.
Well, I want to thank you so much for a really fun conversation. I love talking about this history and trying to relate it to the world we're in. So I really appreciate it. People can follow my work on Twitter at Adnan A. Hussein. I also have a YouTube channel, a show, pardon me, the Adnan Hussein Show. And I'm also co-host of Guerrilla History podcast. And so people can find, kind of what I'm thinking about and talking about, a lot of geopolitical analysis, history, religion, politics on all those platforms.
I will link to them in the description box below, and we will certainly have you back for our next talk. Adnan Hussein, thank you very much for your time today.